Bats are really a poster child for wildlife health. I was a clinical vet for 5 years, treated a lot of bats while I was in practice. I treated about 300 bats a year. They've been up to all sorts of mischief, caught in barbed wire, attacked by dogs, attacked by cats, caught in fruit netting. So any of you that use fruit netting on your fruit trees, make sure it's tied around the base of the tree because they go up inside there and they get really tangled, and that can be quite serious. And a whole host of other various misadventures that they got into. And then I came back to Charles Sturt and did a PhD here. And my research is primarily on viral and parasite evolution in wildlife. But I've had a long time of involvement in the wildlife health space more generally. And at the moment I'm the Deputy Chair of Wildlife Health Australia, which is Australia's peak body for wildlife health, and also the Vice President of the International Wildlife Disease Association. So I'm sort of very involved with the broader wildlife health picture around the world. And the reason why I wanted to come down here, like I said, wildlife health is very complex to get your head around because it's got many different parts to it and what I mean by wildlife health. And bats are a really good example of that complexity, and you'll see in the sort of what I talk about just how things go in all different directions and how the role that people play in that. And obviously this has become a big topic in the last year, as all of you are aware. So it's a pretty familiar story to you, but where I want to begin was with pretty much a single bat. So and this bat almost certainly was stressed, and it was infected with a virus that a lot of bats get infected with. And the virus has been present in bats, doesn't really do anything to them, doesn't make them sick for millions of years. It's a normal virus in them. And that bat was shedding this virus because it was a bit stressed. And unfortunately, the virus was picked up by another animal, almost certainly a mammal. And that other animal managed to amplify that virus and give it a new opportunity to evolve a little bit. And then that virus spilt over into a species that animal, intermediate animal, is very closely associated with, and that's us. And that gave rise to one of the most deadly viruses known to people. And the place where that happened, as you'll be pretty aware by now, is actually Brisbane. And it was a suburb called Hendra, and the virus that I'm talking about actually is Hendra virus. And it's one of the most deadly viruses known. Now, this happened in 1994, the first time that this happened, in the suburb of Hendra. And we can count our lucky stars here in Australia that it happened to be Hendra virus. Because Hendra is very deadly, but fortunately when Hendra gets into people, it's not contagious, or not very contagious. It's not able to be transmitted from person to person. And you'll be aware of some pretty stark contrast to that. So bats are really important in this regard because it's not just Hendra viruses that they are host to. They're host to Nipah viruses that are very closely related. And they're host to a bunch of other viruses, including the beta coronaviruses that have given rise to COVID-19. Rabies viruses originate from bats. We have our own rabies here, and it's one of the main reasons why members of the public should not touch bats in Australia, any kind of bat, without being vaccinated for rabies. It's a very high risk. I've seen rabid bats in my career. They're quite spectacular to see. And there are also other viruses like the Ebola viruses and the hemorrhagic viruses that all are found naturally in bats. And I'm going to touch a little bit on why bats, like why viruses in bats, and why have they caused these important diseases in people, including COVID-19. But before I do that, what I want to just touch on are the bats that Hendra virus came from. So the bat that Hendra virus came from almost certainly was a black flying fox. We've got 4 species of flying fox in Australia, and there are 2 of them on Bat Island. The main ones that you can see here are called grey-headed flying foxes, and they're Australia's largest flying fox. They're certainly not the largest flying fox in the world. That title goes to a flying fox I've seen out in eastern New Guinea, and it looks like a small pterodactyl, flies out over the rainforests and there's volcanoes everywhere. They're a very impressive thing to see. But these are grey-headeds, and there are also little red flying foxes here, and they're much more sort of cryptic. Most people aren't aware that they're around, and they have a really unfortunate habit of flying very low, and that means that they tend to get caught in barbed wire. And so one of the main recommendations to protect them is to remove the top barbed wire line and have like a plain line of wire on the top, and then have the rest barbed wire, because then they skim over the fence, they don't get their wings caught on that top line of barbed wire. And you may well see them caught on barbed wire around Wagga. I've seen them before, caught the little reds. Now both of them, and in fact all of the flying fox species, the 4 flying fox species in Australia, are fruit eating and flower eating. And they belong to a group of bats called the megabats, the megapteropterans. And we have 8 species of fruit and flower eating bats in Australia, these megabats. And 4 of them are the flying foxes. Now in Wagga we only have 2 of these fruit and flower eating bats. Now these are unusual bats because they actually originate from our region of the world, the fruit and flower eating bats. Almost certainly in the island chains north of Australia. So New Guinea and out into Fiji, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, and in northern Australia. And they all use primarily vision to find their food, vision and smell, but primarily vision. And they're really unique amongst bats. They're very social usually. Most species are quite social, and the flying foxes particularly have big colonies that they live in like this. And their social structure is very, very important to their biology and ecology, and taps into a little bit about why we see disease from them. The other thing is that because there's a lot of them, and because they've evolved in Australasia, they play really important ecosystem services. So they play a big role in seed dispersal. So they eat fruits and they move to nearby trees, and then they crap out the seeds, or spit out the seeds actually mostly. And so they disperse seeds. But what's even more important in the Australian landscape is pollination. And they are one of the key pollinators in Australia, very, very important pollinators. So they play a major role in movement of plant genetics in the landscape. And we sort of forget how important that is over the medium term. It's going to become a lot more important in the coming few hundred years, but it is a really important role that they play. Now, flying foxes and the fruit bats are, even though we've got quite a few species in this region, they're only a very small proportion of the diversity of bats from around the world. Bats actually make up a quarter of all mammal species in the world. They're found on every single continent except for Antarctica. And in fact, just to put it in perspective, because their global diversity is quite high, but their site diversity is very high. So we've got in Wagga region, in the Wagga LGA, we've got about 36 mammal species. How many of those are bats, do you reckon? 36 mammal species. How many bat species do you reckon we've got in Wagga government area, local government area? No? So there's 2 flying foxes. There's a lot of other bats though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
14.
10. Give you a raise on that one?
14.
More?
20.
20.
Really?
So more than half of all of the species of mammals in the Wagga area are bats. And the interesting thing about bats is that they've been around for a very long time. So they emerged very soon after the extinction of the dinosaurs and the flying reptiles, taking advantage of the niche that was there, same with most lineages of modern birds. The thing about them is that obviously one of the first things that appeared in bats is the ability to fly. And that is a really important feature because it meant that firstly, they appeared everywhere in the world very quickly. So actually one of the oldest bat fossils in the world, even though we think bats evolved in the northern hemisphere, one of the oldest bat fossils in the world, 55 million years old, is in Australia. And there's some good fossils in southeast Queensland of one of the oldest bat species. And it showed that when they appeared, they spread pretty much everywhere very, very quickly, which makes sense because they could fly and they're actually good dispersers over waterways. The other thing that's important about flight is that they had to make quite a few important adaptations, a bit like birds. So they had to have a really high heart rate, really high metabolic rate, and they had to have very low body weight, so the way they make their body is sort of designed for flight. But the other little thing, and this touches a little bit on why viruses in bats, is that when you mount an immune response to an infection, it costs you a lot of energy. So it's very energetically costly to fight off infectious diseases. And if you're flying, you can't afford that energy. So over a long period of time, they've developed a strategy of what we call immunotolerance. They just put up with their viruses. The viruses don't cause enough problem for them to actually bother to mount an immune system to get rid of them. So they'll just tolerate their viral infections and save energy doing that so they can fly around and get the food that they need. And that's one of the reasons why bats are an important source of viral infections for people and other species. The other thing about bats that's sort of really hidden from us is that we think about their species diversity, but when the lights go off at night, what we miss and what's sort of hidden to us is that the skies of the terrestrial Earth are absolutely full of bats. So they are the second most species diverse group of mammals after rodents, but they are by some margin the most abundant mammals on Earth. They're far more abundant than rodents, and they're far more abundant than primates, including us. So every night when the sun goes down, the skies of the Earth are full of billions and billions of bats. Yeah?
We have bats at our house.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're finding them in our house as well. They're flying foxes, and almost certainly they're coming from here. So they fly a long way out into the landscape every night. And that touches on another thing that's really important about them, and that is that because they're so abundant, because they've been here for such a long time, they play a major, major role in ecosystems. And one of them obviously is that flower and pollination and seed dispersal. But the much bigger one really is as insectivores. So a lot of those bats are, the vast majority of the world's bats are insectivores. There are some that eat fish, there are some that eat small mammals, they have all sorts of strategies, but the vast majority are insectivores. And every night they apply a huge downward pressure on insect populations around the world. And I'll touch on why that is really important in a second. The other thing about the abundance is that that's another reason why we see bat viruses being important to humans. So the next most abundant group of mammals in the world are rodents. And rodents also are responsible for very important pandemic diseases in people. And of note, the plague originates from rodents, but there are a number of other viral diseases and things. So partly it's just that there are so many, and that's why we see diseases coming from them into people and other species. And that makes sense. If there's hardly anything around, then you're not going to get viruses from them. Now, the fact that they've been around for so long and play these ecosystem services means that a lot of our ecosystems depend on those and don't have an easy way of replacing those services. And that means that a lot of the threats that they're facing, and the grey-headed flying fox is a threatened species, both in New South Wales and in the Commonwealth. The spectacled flying fox is another Australian threatened bat species. They're facing some very, very unusual and complex and difficult threats. So one of them is not present here yet, and in fact it's something that is normally found in Europe, in bat caves in Europe, and it's a fungus. And it causes a disease called white nose syndrome. And a caver in 2006, would have been just one person, took their caving gear, went over to Europe, or they were a European, they'd been caving in caves in Europe, and there's bat guano almost certainly on their caving gear, just dust on their caving gear, came back to New York State, and they went caving with their gear. And they introduced one of the most devastating diseases that has ever affected mammals. And it's called white nose syndrome. It's a fungus, and it's spread now since 2006 through North America, Canada and the United States. It's caused the deaths of millions and millions of bats. 8 species of microbats have collapsed catastrophically. It's already thought to be costing the US agricultural industry more than $2 billion in extra insecticides every year in terms of the lost insect suppression. And the prediction is that it will lead to the extinction of a number of bat species eventually. And there's essentially no way that at this point we can deal with it. It's predicted that eventually it will enter Australia, but there's a lot of work trying to both prevent that through caver education, but also through trying to model where it would appear and what species it would affect. And there's a couple of Australian species that are quite vulnerable, it looks like. So a real concern. The other disease threat to bats is quite a new one, and this might surprise you, but it's COVID-19. So this is the weird thing about it, because it comes from bats. We know it comes from bats. All the beta coronaviruses originate in bats. We don't know what the intermediate species was, but we know that at some point in the last 30 years, it was in a bat. And then it went into another species, and then finally it ended up in people. Now, the beta coronaviruses, fortunately, not found in our flying foxes. In fact, not found in any of our bats in Australia, as far as we know. But what that means is that they're very, very vulnerable to us infecting them with COVID-19. Now, fortunately, in Australia, that's become very unlikely, fortunately. But there was a real panic early on this year about all the people who research bats, all the bat carers out there, to put in controls to make sure that if someone gets infected with COVID-19, they don't unleash Pandora's box by introducing a new virus that is already adapted for bats straight back into our naive bat populations in Australia. And they're facing major concerns about that now in North America, obviously, and in Europe. So you know, it does show you the complexity of some of these things that we think are quite simple and unidirectional. Obviously, diseases are not the main threat for bats, and particularly not in Australia. But there are some important things that kill bats that are a major threat. One of the ones that's been emerging, and I used to see this a bit when I was in practice, but it's become really significant in the last 5 years, and you'll understand why, is heat stress mortalities. So bats have quite a distinct thermal threshold, like a lot of species in the landscape, and they're acting as a bit of a sentinel for what's going to happen in the coming decades. And that is that you get these days where the thermal threshold exceeds what they can cope with physiologically, and they die. In 2018, in one single day, a third of the world's population of spectacled flying foxes in far north Queensland, one of the main pollinators of tropical rainforests, died. So from heat stress event. Now this is a major, major concern, and it's been compounded with the fact that we're also seeing drought and starvation playing a major role. So last year, you know, while the fires were going and there's all this sort of catastrophe in the news, what really flew under the radar is we're having mass mortalities of bats up and down the east coast of Australia from starvation, from the drought. This is another compounding factor. And these are species that already have declined spectacularly in the last 200 years. So we're really concerned about their loss in the future. What is a little bit encouraging, however, is that bats, flying foxes particularly, are really clever and they're really adaptable. And there's a few signs that they might be behaviourally adapting to some of these changes. So for instance, one of the things that they do on really hot days in some areas now that we've never seen before is that they will actually come down in the canopy, down into the lower canopy and stay there because it's cooler. And that's meaning that they're not being affected as much. And there are also a few clever strategies that people are coming up with to help drive that. So using drones to scare them down into the lower canopy on hot days, and also installing misters in these kinds of colonies to mist to reduce the temperature. So there are ways we might be able to help them. One of the problems though is that when you put these kinds of ecological pressures on a species, like bats, they get stressed, just like when we get stressed, they get sick. Now they already have these viruses, and the problem is that when wildlife is stressed, they tend to shed a lot more virus. And that's a major risk for spillover into new species. And this is where our Hendra story comes in. This is where Landcare actually comes in. So the interesting thing about Hendra is that flying foxes and Hendra have been in Australia for millions of years. People have been in Australia for 50, 60,000 years. Horses have been in Australia, because they're the intermediate host, they're the key amplifying host, for 200 years. They arrived actually on the first fleet. So all of the pieces of the puzzle have been there, and in fact horses were more common after the Second World War, just after the Second World War, than they were in recent decades. But Hendra only emerged in 1994. So only the first spillover into people only happened in 1994. And it's been happening more and more since then. And a lot of us have been sort of scratching our heads going, well, why? Why is that happening? Why now? Like, what's the thing that's happened? And a really fantastic Aussie researcher, actually, who's based over in the States, has worked it out. And essentially what it is it's ecological pressure on flying foxes at certain times of the year. So specifically in the early winter. What happens on the east coast is that flying foxes in summer go up into the ranges and they feed in the forest there. As you know, most of those are pretty well conserved. A lot of the national park estate is on the ranges on the east coast. And then in the winter, they come down to the flowering coastal forests, and particularly spotted gum forests. So they would come and they would aggregate in huge colonies. They love being in large populations. Their stress is much lower when they're in large aggregates like this, or even much, much bigger than this actually. The problem is that we've cleared a lot of those flowering forests on the coastal strip, particularly for urban development. And that's been in the last sort of, since about the 70s, it's sort of accelerated. And so the problem is they come down, they're nutritionally stressed because they can't get enough food. They're having to fracture up into smaller colonies. A lot of those colonies are now found in urban environments. People are saying bats are disappearing, like they are here. And that's because the big food aggregates that used to be there are no longer there, so they're having to disperse in the landscape. They're having to travel a lot further to access food, and that puts them under more physiological stress. And that is driving the spillover of Hendra virus out of bats into the environment. And it just takes a horse to come along under a tree, like a camphor laurel or something like that, where you'll find bats in, sit in a paddock, because there aren't these huge tracts of spotted gum forest anymore. And that will be enough to cause a Hendra virus spillover. And it's become so clear that now we can model to within a couple of months when it's going to happen. So Hunter Valley outbreak last year was predicted about a month and a half before it happened. Mackay outbreak before that was predicted, and they were notified, the public health authorities were notified 2 months before it happened, because we know what's happening now in the landscape. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, what actually happens when they shed the virus? Like, how does that actually happen?
Yeah, okay, so what they do is they're normally infected, and that's in a bunch of different organs in their body, and it doesn't usually make them sick at all. And it's only a couple of bat species as well. Grey-headed flying foxes, at this point in time, are not thought to be a major reservoir for Hendra. Black flying foxes are probably the key species. Little red flying foxes may be, but the black flying foxes are almost certainly the key species. And we've never seen Hendra outside of their range. So they get infected, they'll keep the virus. When they're stressed, the immune system shuts down, and the virus can reproduce itself, and they start shedding it mainly through urine. And then the problem is that they sit in a tree, they're urinating underneath the tree. Hendra virus survives for a very, very short time in the environment, for definitely less than a day, but probably in most environments less than a few hours. The problem is that it loves cool, moist environments, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with the East Coast in sort of winter, but it really dries off, particularly on the North Coast. But where you find the nice green growth is underneath the single paddock trees. You find nice green growth, and it's cool and it's moist under there. So it's like a perfect Hendra incubation spot. And that's where the horses go, because that's where the green grass is. So they'll get up in the first thing in the morning, they'll go straight down and get their nice little feed of Hendra under the tree. So a major, now one of the interventions that's very simple that can protect horses and people from Hendra is just simply to fence off those trees. But to really prevent Hendra, and this is where this research in the States has taken another level, the key thing is trying to turn back that clock on that pressure that's driving it. But it doesn't just help with Hendra spillover, it helps with all of the ecosystem services that these guys provide, and that's through reforestation. So reforestation is actually regarded the key strategy to solve the Hendra problem, is reforestation. The other thing about reforestation is that wildlife diseases correlate very, very strongly around the world with deforestation. So Ebola emergence is a really big one. There's a lot of evidence now that Ebola outbreaks and pandemics are strongly associated with areas that have experienced deforestation. So it does show, you know, one of the really big things that needs to be addressed here is that pressure that we put on the natural environment. And we change the relationship between species, we put species under pressure, and that can lead to these important disease spillovers, in both directions as well, back into wildlife. So one of the things I just also want to just finish on is that these are massive, massive problems. Like, obviously, all of them are massive. They're far beyond the scope or resourcing of governments. They're also problems that are mainly problems of scale and human behaviour. And obviously that makes them not easily solved with technological innovations. And that's where community engagement in wildlife health becomes really, really important, and for a few different reasons. So one of the big spaces that I'm looking at is how to engage people in detecting wildlife diseases really early, because we don't have a lot of tools to deal with them, particularly once they've been in the environment for very long at all. So using community to help detect wildlife diseases. But I think beyond that, we really, really need to start conveying these stories and getting people to understand how these kinds of things, these kinds of behaviours, just sort of go out and then they do a boomerang and they come right back at us and they impact us, not just in terms of disease, but in all of the other things that these kinds of species do for us in the environment. And so that's really where the community engagement comes in. Now, I'm not sure if any of you have seen, I have sort of put on Facebook and it's sort of gone a little bit out. There's a link to a survey, and that's to look at aspects of community participation in wildlife health. If you do see it, I'd encourage you to do it, because we're really interested. I've got a couple of sociologist colleagues down in Albury. We're really interested to see how we can engage people in this space, what the community's needs are in this space, and how we can sort of build a better wildlife health system in Australia that's really focused more on community, because it really is all about community.
What's the Facebook page?
I might just, if we got is there a Wagga Wagga Urban Landcare?
Put it on the MLI website.
Okay, cool.
Send it round in the
Yeah, okay.
Okay, yeah, have a look in there. And
We'll promote it as part of our wrap-up.
oh, great. Yeah, great. Yeah, great. No, that'd be great. Yeah, it's a good opportunity for us to find out what the community want really, and what they can offer as well. Any questions or?
I live along
Yeah.
Tarcutta Street, and don't ask me what the trees are.
Yeah.
But every evening, just before it gets really dark, you just see the sky filled
Yep.
with all like the big bats heading across town.
Yes.
Do they actually roost in town? Because they definitely stop in some of those trees.
That's
on
right.
Tarcutta
Yeah.
Street.
This is the main roost for them. So they come from here. There are a few other roosting spots, but they will mostly aggregate at single roosts. So this is the main one in the Wagga area.
When they hang around those trees, they're just
They're feeding, so they tend to do like at night, there are two different strategies for their feeding. They tend to, most bats will do sort of like a hopping pattern. They'll stop together in a few trees and then they'll sort of disperse further and further. Some bats will actually just fly right out, and they'll fly a long ways. They'll fly 50 k's, no worries, out into the surrounding landscape. They're mostly looking for flowering trees. We mistakenly think of them as being fruit bats, but they're actually mostly pollen bats, pollen and nectar. So that's why they're really common at the moment in the Wagga area, because there's a lot of flowering eucalypts. You know, most of you would have seen the yellow box were spectacular at uni this year, and also there's Blakeleys that are flowering, and grey box and stuff all flowering in the last month. But also a lot of the introduced species. So things like the silky oak, or the big introduced. They're a rainforest species from Australia, but they're common in urban Wagga. They love those. Bottlebrush, things like that. That's why they've. And they've actually, that's the other thing, is that they are becoming much more common in Wagga, they've expanded down into Melbourne and to Adelaide as well. And that's because these urban environments are providing a more reliable food source because of the ecological impacts that are happening in their natural habitat, particularly on the coastal strip of Eastern Australia.
But then they'll come back here to.
That's right.
Here to feed.
That's right. So these guys don't stay here all year. They go back up to northern New South Wales and Queensland. They only come down here seasonally. There's some colonies that are seasonal. There's some colonies that are completely temporary. They'll pop up for a year or two and then disappear. So the Bateman's Bay colony used to be like that, although I think that's becoming a permanent seasonal colony now. And there are some colonies, and the Sydney Botanic Gardens are a good example of this, that are called backpackers colonies. And that's because they're just a stop off. Like the bats don't really live there for a long time. They might stop there for a week or two and then they move off to another colony. They use it as like as a backpacker.
So these ones go over my house in Laurel Road towards
Yep,
Rawling
that's
Park
right.
every night. They must
Yes.
have said a fair
They do just go like this every night. If you're down here, they'll just fly off in every direction. For a small colony like that, it's great to see, but it's not as spectacular. But if you're in Port Macquarie or somewhere where there's some bigger colonies, it's definitely worth going there in the evening and just watching them fly into the landscape. And if you ever get the chance, and this is a bucket list thing, there's a fruit bat, because the fruit bats originated from here in Australasia, but they've spread out into Africa as well. And there's a fruit bat species there called the straw-coloured fruit bat. They're quite small. There's a colony at one single site in Zambia that has more than 8 million bats. And every night, in about 15 minutes, you just start to see them just swarming around this colony, and then the night sky is just filled with bats, just absolutely silent, just flying in every direction, just as far as the eye can see, just bats, millions and millions of bats. And that's sort of how, and then they'll be out foraging, and then in the morning they start scraggly, they come back over hours, once they've finished foraging, they'll start coming back. It's definitely a bucket list one, Kasanka National Park. If you're ever hanging around Africa in the future, go make a beeline for it. It's one of the most impressive things you'll ever see. Yes?
Would you know how many species of bats there are in the world?
No, I don't actually know how many species of bats there are in the world. A quarter of all the mammal species are bats. And I'd have to think how many mammal species there are. There'd be a few, 4,000 or 5,000. So you'd be looking at least 1,000 bat species, I would have thought, in the world. So yeah, a lot of bats. The other thing is that we don't know all of the species in the world, and in some places, even parts of the world like in Papua New Guinea, there are still new species that have been discovered, but even bats, even big things like bats. So there's still a lot of new species in the world.
There's a population in Picton that's probably in the last, 8 years,
Just popped up.
Assemble.
Yeah.
There's a creek there, it's got a fairly steep gorge to it, and they're predominantly sitting on the western side of that. But I'd estimate it's probably maybe 4 times.
Yes.
The quantity here.
Yeah, absolutely. And the two things that are driving these new colonies popping up, because you'll hear a lot of people like in Bateman's Bay and places like that saying, oh, this bats never used to be here. Well, the two things that are driving that, firstly, is the urban areas are proving to be a more reliable food source, but it's not a great food source. It's very much a second option for them. The bigger thing is loss of flowering forests means that the colonies that used to be way away from people, that had hundreds of thousands of bats, are fracturing up. And that's why we're starting to see them pop up in unusual places. And that's happening right across the landscape. So, and there's really good modelling now to show that. And that fracturing is like the absolute signal that you're going to get a Hendra virus outbreak. It's that. As soon as you see that, it's like they're under massive nutritional stress, they're under social stress, and that's when the modellers that are all up in Griffith University and over in the States raise the sort of flag it with DPI and with public health.
That's a coastal thing though.
It is. So Hendra virus has only been found at this point down to the Hunter Valley. The Hunter Valley the first detection was last year, and that just caught everyone by surprise, except for the people who model it, who said it's going to happen in the Hunter Valley this year. But what I would probably say is that it's a very dynamic situation, and a lot of people in the Riverina are pretty blasé about Hendra. It is a very deadly virus. If I had a horse, I would make absolutely sure it's vaccinated. And I know the compliance and vaccination is a major problem, but you don't want to get Hendra virus. It's like playing Russian roulette. I think it is inevitable that we will see spillovers into people, or horses at least, maybe into people outside of that classic distribution in coming years, particularly as these sorts of things like droughts force unusual species in and down south, which is what happened last year.
So what about rabies, like the flying foxes in Wagga in everybody's fruit trees?
Yes.
Do we have to be aware of other things like that? Or
Yeah, so rabies are found, yeah, so we have to treat all bats as if they could carry rabies. Rabies is not very infectious for people. You need to be bitten by an animal that's infected. And bats don't attack people even if they have rabies. So the key thing is that, which is quite different from classical rabies in carnivores overseas, so where dogs will actually bite someone. So the only way, well, the key thing to protect yourself from rabies from bats, which is found all around the world, is don't handle them. So unless you're vaccinated for rabies, don't handle them. If you do see bats on the ground, then the best thing to do is call a wires carer. So all wires carers that handle bats are vaccinated, and many vets as well now. Well, more and more vets have been vaccinated as well for rabies, which is really important. So yeah, that's again, it's a very low risk. Yeah, best not to touch it with your bare hands. Probably rabies is the least of your issues if you're. But, yeah, and that's not to do. That's not what to do. Yeah, yeah. So that's what's not to do. But yeah, no, I think, look, the key thing with bats and rabies is that don't handle live bats unless you're vaccinated for rabies. And the best thing to do if you do see an injured bat, it's a good idea to call wires, and they'll look after that for you.
why is a rabid bat so spectacular?
It's very similar to any rabid animal. Like it's sort of interesting with bats. So in dogs that get rabies, classical rabies overseas, classical rabies is an aggressive rabies. There's a whole lot of rabies is a very strange viral infection, and it causes a whole lot of very particular signs. Hydrophobia, so animals that are infected with rabies are terrified of water, including people. It's like a pathological fear of water. But the other thing is this aggression, and that's linked into how rabies is transmitted through a bite. With bats, there are actually two ways that they present, and I've seen both of them. Probably the more common way that they present is passive, and they're just so, it's like, hello, they're just so passive, it's really quite unusual. Abnormally passive for a wild bat, although these guys are really intelligent, and when you pick them up and care, and if you're not aggressive to them, they very quickly relax. But the passive rabid bats are very unusually non-responsive type passive. The aggressive ones show that classical rabies aggression, and I don't know if any of you have ever seen a rabid animal. It's really distinct. It's very different from any kind of other aggression you'll see in an animal. Like you'll see an aggressive dog. Most aggression in animals is driven out of fear. And so you see this sort of like, it's like an intelligent aggression. It's like got a reason. A rabid aggressive animal, it's psychotic. There's nothing rational about it. They would just kill themselves trying to attack you. Like there's no fear at all. And that's what it's like in bats. So I've seen that before. Again, you have to really go up and get close to them. But they'll just be savage in a way that's just very unusual. It's like, and like I said, I've handled hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of flying foxes over the years. And they're actually extraordinarily placid animals, and really they recognise our facial expressions, and it's quite easy to sort of, if you are relaxed and confident around them, they actually rarely chill out quite quickly. They realise that you're not a threat. And the most distinct example I remember of this was actually in vet practice. And as per usual, long hours, and I was exhausted, and I had there was a bat in front of me, and on a treaty its wing, and I yawned, and it just looked at me and it got that contagious yawn, and it started yawning, and I was like, they just like, they really, and we know that they do recognise human facial expressions. It's a very similar facial structure, and the way that they are so social also is very similar to people. That's another one of the things that may be why they carry a lot of different viral infections, bats, is because they have big social structures, a bit like people. So,
Can I ask, because we
yeah.
come in town too, got a mulberry tree next to our house. They come over, they poo all over the
Yeah,
car.
that's right, yeah.
You pick anything up and sometimes there's bat poo on it.
Yep.
I just wonder, is there any way that they transmit diseases if you're in contact with that or mosquitoes?
Yeah, it's very, very, very low risk. So, in fact, the really high risk for people is probably more in rodent urine. And we don't see that, but things like leptospirosis in rodent urine is much higher risk. So Hendra virus has never been shown to spread directly into people. So that's a really important thing. And that's despite probably quite a number of scenarios where it could have. And that's particularly with wildlife carers. Wildlife carers, Hendra virus is quite prevalent on the East Coast, and wildlife carers have been bitten and scratched by Hendra virus infected bats, and they haven't got it. Now that relates to almost certainly to on the outside of Hendra virus is this very delicate envelope that's a bit like our cell membrane, and there's certain receptors on that allow, or certain proteins on that allow it to infect another animal's cells. Works really well for other bats, obviously. Works okay for horses. When the virus reproduces in the horse, when it comes out, it has the horse cell membrane on it with new proteins on it that are related more to the horse, or the cell membrane's a horse one. And that probably that is probably the key that allows it then to infect a person. So at this point, there's no evidence that Hendra can directly infect people. So the only viral disease in bats that we have to worry about in Australia, fortunately, is rabies, and that's not transmitted through feces or urine or anything like that. It's really through bites. That's rabies. Yeah, lyssavirus is just another name for rabies. Yep, Australian bat lyssaviruses are rabies here. So we do actually have rabies in Australia. It's just not classical rabies. It's Australian bat lyssavirus.
Thank you. We might
Yeah.
do stories.
Actually, an island classified as an island, or is it just
Yeah, just two little islands here. So there are two little islands. Yeah, they I guess it's near to Urban Wagga, so that's why they like it. Because there are a few more bigger islands a bit further upstream, but they like it. And the islands are, the benefit for the islands for them are snakes. Although snakes could get across this, a big python could get across here, but they do like island colonies.
I assume we're on private property here.
This is belongs. Actually, just here, just the edge of the river, I think is not. I think that's Crown land. Yeah, but just up there's a caravan park. Yeah.
How would you actually get to here though? Or
Normally not.
intention not to?
No. So if you're doing surveying of bats, you'd come up on the river. Would be the most reliable public access route.
Can you see it from the other?
You can, yeah. Although that's farm. Yeah, that's a farm, private farm. So it is a hard site to access. Sorry?
Bats have many predators.
Yeah, they do actually. So pythons are a big one. Pythons love bats. The flying foxes at least. The other big one are birds of prey. So, and I've seen quite a lot of bats with bird of prey injuries. Big talon marks in the skull, or in the back of in their back. You see these sort of classic puncture marks. So birds of prey and pythons would be the main two predators of flying foxes. Overseas, there are, particularly for cave roosting bats, there are snakes that evolved to be specialist bat feeders, and there's even a bat falcon that is a specialist bat feeder. So
Is that why they hang upside down? To roost?
that's right. Yeah, it's sort of.
Protective thing, or is
It's just part of their anatomy actually. So like the way that they've really lost a lot of the use of their forelimbs, although these guys still have quite a prominent thumb with a big claw. So when they need to go to the toilet, what they do is they just turn up, hook their thumbs on, prop upright, go to the toilet, and then hang back upside down, in case you're wondering. It's a, I always hear this, I was like, how does that work? So, yeah.
So the ones
That
that
they're using the drones to push them down,
Yeah.
are they more likely then to have the predators?
Yeah, what they're doing is that, and this is where, I'm actually putting in a grant to develop some predictive modelling for this as well for heat stress events. And but when there's a heat wave forecast, the idea is that you only just use them on that day, just to get them to go down out of the because there's quite that high canopy is much hotter than even 4 or 5 metres down into the canopy. The rainforest particularly provides a really insulating effect. But it does, the interesting thing about those thermal thresholds is that these are a canary in the coal mine. Many species have a thermal threshold above which they die. And many plants have a thermal threshold above which they die. And this is the big concern really, is that you only need 1 day a year to go over that thermal threshold. You only need 1 day to go over that thermal threshold. That's the big problem for a lot of species.
I guess one of the key reasons for the video especially is awareness of the importance of biodiversity corridors in Wagga.
Yes.
And even in the Daily Advertiser yesterday, there's a piece from the Tumut Mayor about grazing or developing Crown land because of the bushfire risk. And we're hearing conversations in Wagga now about things that are threatened and should automatically be protected.
Yes.
That could well get developed and a habitat for these threatened species because they're in that
That's right.
corridor that I see them and other species
Yes.
moving around. So let us know if you object to being filmed or anything, but we thought it would happen pretty quick, but I said, well, we've got a little bit of funding, can we
Yes.
please use this as an awareness raising tool?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dispel some of these
Yes.
issue. People, we're going to probably get a little bit of negativity back, but we
Yes.
we can dispel that now that you've...
I think the really important thing is that, it's all about relieving pressure on ecosystems. If you want to protect people from disease, wildlife disease, the key way to do that is to relieve pressure on ecosystems. And it's that pressure that is what's causing the emergence of things like COVID-19 and disease spillover into people and other animals. So corridors, reforestation projects, all of those things relieve pressure from ecosystems and from wildlife particularly. It's easier for them to feed. They don't have to fly so far. There's more food resources nearby. And those things mean that they are happy and healthy. And that means that we stay happy and healthy. So that's the key. Really.